The grand selection chamber of the Volanthi hegemony had never felt so cold, and Princess Calithvorn Sai had never felt so small. As she stood upon the ceremonial platform, while the eyes of a dozen alien delegations judged her, worth like merchants inspecting damaged goods at a market stall, she was the third daughter of Emperor Vorath Varnsai, ruler of 17 star systems and commander of the greatest fleet in the Eastern Spiral Arm. Yet none of that mattered on this day, because today was the selection. And today she would learn whether any species in the known galaxy considered her worthy of alliance through marriage. Her silver-blue skin glowed softly under the chamber lights, and her 4 violet eyes remained steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach like a living thing trying to escape. And her cranial ridges curved elegantly above her face in patterns that her attendants had spent hours polishing to perfection. She was beautiful by Volanthi standards, or so she had been told her entire life. But beauty meant nothing in the grand game of galactic politics, where marriages between royal houses were calculated with the same cold precision as trade agreements and military treaties. The first delegation to speak was the Krethali, a species of massive reptilian predators who ruled an empire nearly as large as the hegemony itself. And their ambassador rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a creature built for hunting and killing. His name was Prince Vorik Krethel, and he stood 8 feet tall with scales that shimmered like polished obsidian and 4 arms that ended in claws, capable of tearing through starship hulls. And when he spoke, his voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. The Krethali Empire has reviewed the proposal, he announced, his golden eyes sliding over Keleth with barely concealed contempt. And we find Princess Steleth to hold insufficient strategic value for a union with our royal bloodline. A murmur rippled through the gathered delegates, and Keleth felt her hearts, all 3 of them, clench painfully in her chest. But she kept her face expressionless, because showing weakness would only make things worse. She is merely the third daughter, Vorik continued, far removed from succession. And at only 90 cycles, she is barely past adolescence by the standards of any civilized species. And we require a bride who can provide immediate political advantage, not a child who may not mature into usefulness for another century. He sat down without another glance in her direction, dismissing her existence as easily as one might dismiss a servant who had brought the wrong drink. The Mordesi delegation spoke next. Their ambassador, a tall insectoid creature with compound eyes that reflected the light in fractured rainbows, and her voice clicked and buzzed as translation devices converted her speech into the common tongue. The Mordesi Consortium has analyzed the economic prospects of this union, she declared, and we find the dowry worlds offered with Princess Keleth to be economically stagnant, and their resource outputs fall below acceptable thresholds for investment, and we must therefore decline. Another rejection, another wound carved into Keleth's pride. And still she stood motionless because her father was watching from his throne at the far end of the chamber, and he expected his children to endure humiliation with dignity, even as their futures crumbled around them. The Kirix Hive Prince was next, a towering insectoid being whose body seemed to be made of interlocking segments of black and gold chitin, and his voice emerged from somewhere within his thorax in a series of clicks that the translator struggled to interpret. Genetic analysis indicates suboptimal compatibility for hybridization purposes, he announced without emotion. And the Hive has determined that offspring produced from this union would provide insufficient biological advantages, and we must seek more suitable genetic stock elsewhere. One by one they came forward, 12 species in total, and one by one they found reasons to reject the third princess of the Volanthi hegemony. The Vashtar found her telepathic potential too weak, and the Glorians considered her military training insufficient. And the traders of Nexus Prime calculated that the return on investment would be negative over a standard century. Each rejection was broadcast across the galactic networks for trillions of beings to witness. And Keleth knew that by tomorrow her humiliation would be the subject of commentary programs and gossip feeds from one end of civilized space to the other. She was the princess nobody wanted, the unwanted daughter of a great emperor. And her fate was sealed with every word of dismissal that echoed through the ancient chamber. Emperor Vareth sat upon his throne of crystallized starlight and watched the proceedings with eyes that revealed nothing. And Keleth wondered if he felt any sorrow for her, or if she was simply another failed asset to be written off and forgotten in Volanthi culture. An unchosen princess was a stain upon the dynasty, a mark of shame that could never be erased. And the fate that awaited her was one she had dreaded since childhood: exile to the Temple Moons, those beautiful prison worlds where unwanted royals spent their endless lives in comfortable isolation. Forgotten by history and abandoned by family, she would tend sacred gardens and study ancient texts and grow old without purpose or meaning. And her name would be quietly removed from the official genealogies so that future generations would never know she had existed at all. This was her future, decided by strangers who had spent less than 5 minutes considering her worth before finding her lacking the last delegation. Finished their refusal something about atmospheric incompatibility that Keleth barely heard through the roaring in her ears, and the herald prepared to close the ceremony and seal her fate forever. But then the chamber doors opened one final time. The sound echoed through the vast space like a crack of thunder, and every head turned toward the entrance where a figure stood silhouetted against the light from the corridor beyond. It was small by galactic standards, standing barely 6 feet tall, with only 2 arms and 2 legs and a single pair of eyes set in a disturbingly flat face covered with soft skin in a shade of brown that reminded Keleth of fertile soil after rainfall. The creature wore a uniform of deep black, decorated with silver insignia that no one in the chamber recognized, and it walked forward with a stride that radiated confidence despite the impossibility of what it was doing. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" demanded the chief herald, his forearms waving in agitation as he consulted his ceremonial tablets. This being was not scheduled to participate in the selection, and protocol demands. "The Terran Confederacy," announced a voice from the doorway behind the creature, one of the lesser functionaries who had apparently escorted this uninvited guest into the most sacred ceremony of Volanthi culture. "Presents Commander Jameson Cole, official representative of the human species." Human Skeleth had heard of them, of course, but only in passing references in xenobiology courses and trade reports. And they were a young species, barely 2 centuries removed from their first ventures into space, who had somehow survived on a world so hostile that most galactic analysts classified it as borderline uninhabitable. They lived short lives, less than a single Volanthi century, and they possessed no natural weapons or defenses or special abilities. And their empire, if it could even be called that, consisted of a handful of colony worlds that most species considered too insignificant to notice. Why was one of them here? And what could this Commander Cole possibly want? The human stopped in the center of the chamber and looked around at the assembled delegates with an expression that Keleth could not read. And then his eyes, those strange 2-colored eyes of brown and gold, found her standing alone on the ceremonial platform. He smiled. It was a small expression, just a slight curve of his lips, but something in it made Keleth's heart beat faster for reasons she could not explain. "I apologize for arriving without invitation," Commander Cole said, and his voice was surprisingly warm, despite the hostility radiating from every corner of the chamber. "But I have traveled a very long way to be here today, and I believe I have something important to say." He turned to face Emperor Vareth directly. A breach of protocol so severe that the guards along the walls reached for their weapons. And yet the human showed no fear at all. "Your Majesty," he declared, "I am here to formally offer my suit for Princess Calithvorn Sai, third daughter of the Ascendant Throne. And I ask that my petition be heard before this selection is closed." The silence that followed was absolute. And then, somewhere in the back of the chamber, someone began to laugh. The laughter spread through the grand selection chamber like wildfire, starting from the Crethely delegation and rippling outward, until representatives of a dozen species were shaking with mirth at the absurdity of what they had just witnessed. A tiny, fragile, short-lived human from a species that most galactic powers considered barely worth noticing, had just offered to marry a princess of the Volanti. Hegemony. Prince Vorik Krethel laughed loudest of all, his massive jaws opening wide to reveal rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh, and his forearms slapped against his armored thighs as he struggled to contain his amusement. "This is the best entertainment I have witnessed in decades," the Crethely prince declared. "A creature whose entire species has existed for less time than my grandfather has been alive thinks it can court Volanti royalty." The Mordesi ambassador's compound eyes glittered with cruel delight as she clicked her agreement. And even the emotionless Kirix Hive Prince made a sound that might have been laughter if his species had possessed the ability to find anything funny. Commander Jameson Cole stood in the center of the chamber and waited for the noise to die down, and his expression never changed from that calm, patient look that Keleth found increasingly fascinating. He did not seem angry or embarrassed or afraid, and instead, he simply waited like a man who had all the time in the world and knew that eventually the children would tire of their game's emperor. Vorith did not laugh, and that was perhaps the only thing that prevented the guards from dragging the human away in chains, because the emperor's silence carried weight that no amount of mockery could overcome. "Silence," Vorith commanded, and the chamber fell quiet instantly, because the emperor of the Volanti hegemony was not a being whose patience could be tested lightly, rose from his throne of crystallized starlight and descended the steps until he stood before the human representative, towering over the smaller being by nearly 3 feet, and his 4 violet eyes examined Cole with the cold precision of a predator evaluating potential prey. "You have interrupted the most sacred ceremony of my people," Emperor Vorith said, his voice low and dangerous, "and you have made a petition that borders on insult. So I will give you one opportunity to explain yourself before I decide whether you leave this chamber as a diplomat or as a prisoner." Cole met the Emperor's gaze without flinching, and Keleth found herself holding her breath as she watched this strange alien creature stand before the most powerful being in 17 star systems, as if they were equals. "Your Majesty," Cole replied, "I understand that my presence is unexpected and that my offer may seem presumptuous, but I ask only that you hear me out before passing judgment." "Speak then," Vorith commanded. "And speak quickly." Cole nodded and turned to address the chamber, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the vast space despite his lack of natural amplification organs. "I had listened to 12 species explain why Princess Keleth is not worthy of their attention," he began, "and I have heard them speak of strategic value and economic potential and genetic compatibility as if her worth could be measured in trade agreements and military alliances." He paused to look at the Crethely delegation, and though he was smaller than any of them by a considerable margin, something in his eyes made Prince Vorik's laughter die in his throat. "But not one of them has spoken about who she actually is." Keleth felt something shift in her chest, a flutter of hope that she quickly tried to suppress because hope was dangerous, and she had already been hurt enough today. "I know that Princess Keleth published 3 papers on xenobotany before her 30th cycle," Cole continued, "and I know that her research on cross-species Agricultural adaptation was groundbreaking work that could have transformed food production across the outer colonies. The chamber grew very quiet. I know that she submitted proposals for agricultural reform that would have ended famine on 6 colony worlds, he said. And I know that those proposals were quietly buried by bureaucrats who considered them too expensive to implement and too innovative to understand. Callus stared at the human with all 4 of her eyes wide, because no one had ever spoken about her work in public before, and no one had ever acknowledged that her ideas had been suppressed rather than simply ignored. I know that she designed the botanical gardens in the eastern wing of this very palace, Cole added. Gardens that are considered some of the most beautiful in the hegemony, though I suspect very few of the people in this chamber have ever bothered to visit them. How did he know these things? Callus wondered. And why had he taken the time to learn them when every other suitor had simply reviewed her political value and found it lacking? The Terran Confederacy is young, Cole acknowledged, and we are small. And our lives are short by the standards of most galactic species. But we have learned to recognize potential when we see it. He turned to face Callus directly. And this time, he ignored the outraged gasps from the assembled delegates, who considered such directness to be a grave breach of protocol, Your Highness, he said. And his voice softened in a way that made Callus' heart beat faster. I am not here to acquire an asset or secure a political advantage or improve my species. Genetic stock. He took a step toward the platform, and the guards tensed but did not move because Emperor Vorath had not given the command. I am here because the Terran Confederacy believes that you deserve a partner who sees you as a person rather than a commodity, Cole declared. And we are prepared to offer a full alliance trade routes, technology exchange, military cooperation, not as a purchase price for your hand, but as a gesture of good faith between our peoples. Prince Vorik surged to his feet, his earlier amusement replaced by something that looked very much like anger, and his claws extended as he pointed at the human. This is absurd, he snarled. You cannot seriously expect the Emperor to consider this offer when the Crethali Empire has already expressed interest in future negotiations. You rejected her, Cole interrupted calmly. Less than an hour ago, you stood in this chamber and called her a child with insufficient strategic value. And now you speak of future negotiations as if your words meant nothing? The Crethali prince's scales flushed dark with rage. And for a moment Callus thought he might actually attack the human right there in the middle of the selection chamber. Where I come from, Cole continued, still speaking in that calm, steady voice that seemed to carry more weight than any roar could have managed. We have a saying, the ones who get rejected by fools are usually the ones worth knowing. He turned back to face Emperor Vorath and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of respect that somehow managed to convey confidence rather than submission. I ask nothing more than the traditional courtship period, he said. 30 cycles to prove that humanity's intentions are genuine, and that this alliance would benefit both our peoples. And if I refuse, Vorath asked, his expression unreadable, then I will leave peacefully, and the Terran Confederacy will pursue friendship with the hegemony through other channels. Cole replied, but I believe you will not refuse, Your Majesty, because you strike me as a leader who recognizes an opportunity when one presents itself. The chamber held its breath as Emperor Vorath considered the human's words, and Callus watched her father's face for any sign of what he might be thinking. For a long moment nobody moved, and then slowly, impossibly, the corners of Vorath's mouth curved upward in something that might have been approval. You speak boldly for a representative of such a young species, the Emperor observed. We learned early that the universe does not reward timidity. Cole replied. Vorath turned to look at his daughter, and for the first time in Callith's memory, he seemed to actually see her rather than simply acknowledging her existence. "The petition is accepted," he announced. And the chamber erupted in shocked protests that he silenced with a single raised hand. "Commander Cole of the Terran Confederacy will be granted the traditional 30-cycle courtship period. And at its conclusion, my daughter will make her choice." He looked at Cole one final time. And something passed between them that Keleth could not interpret. "Do not waste this opportunity." "Human!" The Emperor warned. Cole smiled that small, warm smile that had first caught Keleth's attention. "I never do." The first week of the courtship period was the strangest time of Keleth's life, because for the first time since her childhood she found herself actually looking forward to each new day. Commander Cole did not behave like any suitor she had ever read about or imagined, and he certainly did not behave like the alien princes and ambassadors who had spent the selection ceremony calculating her worth in terms of territory and resources. On the first morning, he asked if he could see her botanical gardens she had expected him to grow, bored within minutes, to make polite noises about the beauty of the flowers before steering the conversation toward politics or alliance terms or whatever it was he truly wanted from this arrangement. Instead, he spent 3 hours walking among the plants she had cultivated from seeds gathered across a dozen worlds, and he asked questions that proved he had actually read her research papers rather than simply knowing they existed. "This species here," he said, pointing to a cluster of luminescent flowers that pulsed gently in the artificial sunlight. "Your paper mentioned that it could only survive in specific soil conditions, but you have it growing alongside plants from completely different ecosystems." Keleth felt her cheeks warm with a flush of silver that she hoped he would not notice. "I developed a hybrid growing medium," she explained. "It took nearly a decade of experimentation, but I eventually found a way to modify the soil chemistry so that species from different worlds could share the same space." Cole crouched down to examine the flowers more closely, and there was something in his expression, a genuine fascination that she had never seen in anyone else who looked at her work. "Back on Earth, we have these things called coral reefs," he said. "They are underwater ecosystems where thousands of different species live together in ways that seem impossible until you understand how they support each other." "I have read about Earth's oceans," Keleth admitted. "Your planet seems like a very hostile place," Cole laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine and utterly unlike the mocking laughter that had filled the selection chamber. "It is," he agreed. "Everything on Earth is trying to kill everything else, and somehow life just keeps finding ways to survive anyway." He stood up and looked around at the garden with something like wonder in his eyes. "This place reminds me of that," he said. "Different species that should not be able to coexist, finding ways to thrive together." He smiled at her then, and Keleth felt something flutter in her chest that she did not have a name for. Days that followed were filled with conversations unlike any she had experienced before, because Cole listened when she spoke and asked questions that showed he actually cared about her answers, did not talk about politics or alliances or the strategic value of their potential union. And instead he asked about her childhood and her dreams and the projects she hoped to complete before her life was done. When she mentioned that her proposals for agricultural reform had been rejected, he asked to see them, and then he spent an entire evening reading through her detailed plans while she watched nervously and waited for him to find the flaws that the hegemony's bureaucrats had insisted must be there. "These are brilliant," he said finally, looking up from the documents with an expression of genuine admiration. "The implementation costs are higher in the short term, but the long-term benefits would transform your outer colonies completely." The Ministry of Agriculture said the projections were too optimistic. Keleth replied bitterly. "The Ministry of Agriculture was wrong," Cole said simply. And if this courtship ends the way I hope it will, I would very much like to help you prove them wrong. On the 10th day, he brought her a gift. But it was not jewels or rare metals or any of the traditional offerings that suitors were expected to provide. It was a small container filled with seeds. These are from Earth, he explained as she examined the tiny brown specks with all 4 of her curious eyes. Sunflower seeds and oak acorns and cherry blossom pits. He told her about the sunflowers that turned their faces to follow the sun across the sky, and the oak trees that grew for centuries and became home to countless smaller creatures, and the cherry blossoms that bloomed for only a few weeks each year, but whose brief beauty was celebrated by millions. I thought you might like to try growing them here, he said. They probably will not survive without significant modification to your growing medium, but I suspect you enjoy that kind of challenge. Kelith held the seeds in her hands and felt something crack open inside her chest. Some wall she had built around her hearts to protect herself from the constant disappointment of being unwanted and overlooked. Why are you doing this? She asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. Cole was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle in a way that made her want to weep. Because you are extraordinary, he said. And I suspect no one has ever told you that before. The tears came then, and she did not try to stop them because for the first time in her life, she was crying from joy rather than sorrow. But the galaxy was watching, and not everyone was pleased with how the courtship was progressing. The Galactic news networks broadcast daily updates on the unlikely romance between the human commander and the Volanthi princess, and opinions across civilized space began to shift in unexpected ways. Species that had ignored humanity for centuries suddenly took notice of the young civilization that had dared to court royalty, and trading companies and diplomatic missions began arriving at Terran colony worlds with offers of partnership that would have been unthinkable just months before it. Kretheli Empire watched this development with growing alarm, because Prince Vorik Krethel had not forgotten his humiliation in the selection chamber, and he certainly had not forgiven the human who had caused it on the 15th day of the courtship. Assassins Kamakilith learned about the first attempt only after it had already failed. When Cole appeared at their scheduled meeting with a bandage wrapped around his forearm and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "There was a small incident this morning," he said casually. "Nothing to worry about." She demanded the truth, and eventually he told her about the 3 Kretheli warriors who had ambushed him in the corridor outside his quarters, and how he had fought them off with nothing but a ceremonial blade he had grabbed from a wall display and a fire extinguisher he had used to blind them. "You killed 3 Kretheli assassins by yourself?" she asked in disbelief. "I did not kill anyone," Cole corrected. "I incapacitated them long enough for your palace guards to arrive and take them into custody." He shrugged as if this were a perfectly normal occurrence. "Humans are not very impressive in a straight fight," he admitted, "but we are very good at improvising." The second assassination attempt came 5 days later, and this time the attackers used poison. Gas pumped into Cole's ventilation system while he slept. He survived because he had taken the precaution of installing human-designed air filters that detected the toxins and sealed his quarters automatically. And when Kelith found him the next morning, he was tired but alive and already working on improving his security measures. "You should leave," she told him, hating the words even as she spoke them. "This alliance is not worth your life." Cole looked at her with those strange 2-colored eyes that had become so familiar over the past weeks, and he smiled. "You are worth my life," he said simply, "and I am not going anywhere." The third attempt was the most brazen. A sniper positioned in the gardens, her gardens, who fired a plasma bolt that missed Cole's head by inches and set fire to a stand of trees that Kelith had spent a decade nurturing to maturity. Cole tackled her to the ground and shielded her body with his own, while palace guards swarmed the area. And when the danger had passed, he helped her too, her feet, and brushed the dirt from her robes as if they had simply taken a tumble during a walk. "I'm sorry about your trees," he said. Keleth stared at him for a long moment. At this small, fragile human who had crossed the galaxy to court a princess nobody wanted, and who had now nearly died 3 times for a woman he had known for less than a month. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I would like to choose you." Commander Cole. His smile in that moment was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Please," he replied, "call me James." The challenge came 3 days after Keleth declared her choice. Delivered by a Krethi herald, informal diplomatic. Rogues who entered the palace throne room and announced that Prince Vorik Krethel invoked the ancient right of contested claim. Emperor Varus' expression darkened when he heard the words, and Keleth felt her heart turn to ice because she knew exactly what this meant by ancient Volanthi law. Any suitor could challenge a rival before the final union was formalized, and the challenge could not be refused without bringing shame upon the one who rejected it. And the method of resolution was always the same: combat to incapacitation or death. "The Kreth Ali prince claims prior interest in the princess," the herald announced, "and demands satisfaction through the trial of blood." James stood beside Keleth in the throne room, and she watched his face carefully for any sign of fear. But all she saw was a calm acceptance that terrified her more than panic would have. "I understand," James said quietly. "When and where?" The herald seemed surprised by the human's composure, because surely this tiny soft creature understood what he was facing. Because the Krethali were apex predators who had never lost a ritual duel in their entire recorded history. 3 days hence," the herald replied. "In the arena of resolution, I will be there." After the herald departed, Keleth turned to James with all 4 of her eyes filled with anguish that she could no longer hide. "You cannot do this," she pleaded. "Prince Vorik is one of the deadliest warriors in the Krethali Empire, and he stands 8 feet tall with scales that can deflect plasma fire and claws that can tear through starship armor." "I know," James said. "You will die," she said, and her voice broke on the words. James reached out and took her hands in his, and his grip was warm and steady despite the death sentence he had just accepted. "Maybe," he admitted, "but probably not." "How can you say that?" she demanded. "You have no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities." "I have something better," James interrupted gently. "I have a few billion years of evolution that taught my ancestors how to survive on a planet that wanted them dead. Every single day," he smiled. And there was something fierce behind the warmth that Keleth had never seen before. "Humans are not the strongest species," he said. "We are not the fastest or the toughest or the most dangerous, but we are still here. And every other predator that underestimated us is either extinct or very, very careful around us." Emperor Vareth summoned James to a private audience that evening, and Keleth learned later what her father had said. "You should withdraw," the emperor had advised. "No one will fault you for declining a challenge you cannot win, and the diplomatic consequences can be managed. With respect, Your Majesty," James had replied. "I did not come all this way or walk away when things got difficult. The Krethali have never lost a trial of blood. Then they are overdue." The 3 days passed too quickly, and Keleth spent every moment she could at James's side while he prepared in ways that seemed strange to her Volanthi. Understanding of combat, he did not practice fighting techniques, or study weapons manuals, or consume combat-enhancing chemicals, as any sensible warrior would have done. And instead he ran long distances through the palace corridors until his lungs burned and his legs trembled. And he studied recordings of Kreth Ali duels with an intensity that bordered on obsession. "What are you looking for?" she asked as he watched the same recording for the 20th time. Patterns, he said. Everyone has patterns, even apex predators, on the morning of the duel. The arena of resolution was packed with spectators from across the galaxy, because news of the humans' audacious challenge had spread, and everyone wanted to witness what they assumed would be a very brief and very bloody entertainment. Prince Vorik Krethel entered first, and the crowd roared its approval as the massive predator raised all four of his arms and displayed the claws that had ended so many lives. He wore no armor because he did not need it, and his obsidian scales gleamed in the arena lights like the surface of a neutron star. James entered second, and the crowd's roar turned to confused murmurs because this small creature in simple fighting clothes could not possibly be the humans' champion, but it was. And when the arena master announced his name, James walked to the center of the fighting space with the same calm confidence he had displayed in the selection chamber all those weeks ago. You are either very brave or very stupid, Vorik growled as they faced each other. I have been told it is hard to tell the difference with humans. James replied. The signal sounded, and Vorik attacked. The Krethel prince moved like liquid death, crossing the distance between them in an instant with claws extended, to tear the human apart in the opening seconds of the fight. James dodged it. Should not have been possible. Humans were not fast enough to evade Krethel strikes, but James had not tried to match Vorik's speed, and instead he had started moving before the attack began, reading the predator's body language and positioning himself where the claws would not be. Vorik's first strike missed, and so did his second, and his third, and his fourth. The crowd grew quiet as they watched the impossible unfold, because the human was not winning. He could not win against such an opponent, but he was also not dying, and that alone was a miracle. The fight continued for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. And still James refused to fall. Vorik's attacks grew faster and more savage as his frustration mounted, and some of them landed terrible impacts that sent James sprawling across the arena floor with blood streaming from wounds that would have killed any sensible creature. But every time he fell, James got back up. A shattered arm hung useless at his side, and broken ribs made every breath an agony, and blood poured from a gash above his eye that half blinded him. But still he stood, and still he moved, and still he refused to stay down. Why won't you die? Vorik snarled after the 90th minute, and for the first time there was something other than contempt in his voice, something that might have been fear. James spat blood and smiled through broken teeth. Humans don't know how, he said. The Krethel were apex predators, designed by evolution for explosive bursts of lethal power, but they were not designed for endurance, and no prey had ever forced them to fight for hours on end. Vorik's attacks grew slower as his body began to fail him, because his muscles were built for short hunts rather than prolonged combat, and his nervous system could not sustain the intensity of his assault. Indefinitely, James saw the moment his enemy began to weaken, and he waited with the patience of a species that had once chased prey across endless savannas until the prey collapsed from exhaustion at the 2-hour mark. Vorik lunged with a strike that would have been lethal an hour earlier, but was now slow enough for James to sidestep entirely. The Krethel prince stumbled as his attack met empty air, and for one precious instant his guard dropped. James struck. It was not a powerful blow. He no longer had the strength for powerful blows, but it landed precisely on the nerve cluster beneath Vorik's jaw that Krethel warriors protected above all other vulnerable points. The prince's eyes rolled back, and his massive body crashed to the arena floor like a falling mountain. For a long moment, the only sound was James's ragged breathing as he stood over his defeated opponent, swaying on legs that should not have been able to hold him upright. Then Keleth began to clap, her four hands striking together in a rhythm that echoed through the silent arena. One by one, the spectators joined her, until the sound of applause became a thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the ancient structure. James looked up at the viewing platform where Keleth stood beside her father. And despite his injuries and his exhaustion, he smiled that same warm smile that had first captured her hearts all those weeks ago. "Told you," he said, though the words were too quiet for anyone but himself to hear. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed beside his defeated enemy. The medical teams rushed to both fallen warriors, and the galaxy watched in stunned amazement as the impossible became real. A human had won. The recovery took 3 weeks, and during that time, Keleth rarely left James's bedside in the palace medical wing, where the finest physicians in the hegemony worked to repair the damage his body had endured. The Volanthi doctors marveled at his resilience, because by every medical standard they knew, the human should have died a dozen times during the duel, and at least twice more during the emergency treatment that followed. His bones knitted back together with a speed that seemed impossible for a species without regenerative abilities, and his tissue damage healed through some combination of stubborn cellular determination and medical technology that the human had insisted be brought from Earth. "Your species is terrifying," the chief physician confessed to Keleth one evening, "not because they are powerful, but because they simply refuse to acknowledge when they should be dead." James woke on the 15th day with Keleth holding his uninjured hand, and his first words were an apology for making her worry. She called him an idiot and a fool and a reckless madman. And then she leaned down and pressed her forehead to his in the traditional Volanthi gesture of deep affection. And she told him that she loved him in every language she knew. The wedding preparations began as soon as James could walk again, and the entire galaxy watched with fascination as two worlds prepared to become one through the union of their champions. It would be the most viewed event in galactic history, because the story of the human commander and the unwanted princess had captured imaginations across 1,000 star systems, and everyone wanted to see how the tale would end. The ceremony took place in the grand hall of the Volanthi Palace, the same chamber where James had first interrupted the selection and declared his intentions to a laughing crowd of delegates who had dismissed him as a joke. No one was laughing. Now representatives from every major species filled the viewing galleries, and trillions more watched through broadcasts that reached the farthest corners of civilized space. And even the Kreth Alley had sent a delegation, though Prince Varric himself was notably absent. Keleth wore the traditional silver robes of a Volanthi bride, but woven through the fabric were threads of Tarim blue that caught the light and sparkled like distant stars. And her 4 violet eyes glowed with a happiness that her family had never seen before. James wore his dress uniform, the same black and silver he had worn on that first day, though now it was decorated with new insignia representing his formal adoption into the Volanthi royal lineage. And the faint scars on his face from the duel only made him look more distinguished rather than damaged. Emperor Vareth performed the ceremony himself, and as he spoke the ancient words that would bind his daughter to this human forever, there was something in his voice that might have been pride. "Do you, Commander Jameson Cole of the Terran Confederacy, accept Princess Keleth Vornsai as your partner in all things, to stand beside her in times of joy and sorrow, to support her dreams and share her burdens for all the days of your life?" "I do," James said, and his voice carried clearly to every corner of the vast chamber. "Do you, Princess Keleth Vornsai of the Volanthi hegemony, accept Commander Jameson Cole as your partner in all things, to stand beside him in times of joy and sorrow, to support his dreams and share his burdens for all the days of your life?" "I do," Keleth said, and she had never meant any words more than she meant these. Vareth reached for James's hand to place it in Keleth's according to tradition, but James stopped him with a gentle gesture that made the crowd murmur in confusion. "Your Majesty," James said quietly, so that only the Emperor and Keleth could hear. With your permission, I would like to change one small part of the ceremony. Varth's eyes narrowed with suspicion. But after a moment, he nodded. James turned to face Keleth directly, taking both of her hands in his own rather than waiting for the Emperor to join them. I did not come here to acquire an asset or secure an alliance, he said. And though his voice was soft, the microphones carried his words to every viewer across the galaxy. I came here because I saw a woman who had been overlooked and undervalued by everyone who should have recognized her brilliance. Keleth felt tears forming in her eyes. But she did not try to stop them. I am not here to protect you, James continued, because you do not need protecting, and I am not here to complete you, because you were never incomplete. He smiled that warm smile she had fallen in love with. I am here to stand beside you, he said, as your partner and your equal for as long as we both shall live. Emperor Varth was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was thick with an emotion that Keleth had never heard from him before. The union is blessed, he declared. May the stars themselves bear witness to this bond. The crowd erupted in celebration, and somewhere in the chaos of music and cheering, James and Keleth shared their first kiss as husband and wife. The years that followed were transformative for both their peoples. This Terran-Volanthi alliance became the foundation of a new era in galactic politics, one that valued merit over bloodline and potential over established power. And species that had been ignored or marginalized for millennia found new opportunities for growth and recognition. Keleth's agricultural reforms were finally implemented across the outer colonies, backed now by Terran innovation and funding. And within a decade, the famine world she had dreamed of saving became thriving centers of food production that fed billions. Her research papers were published under her own name and became required reading at scientific academies across the galaxy. And she established a foundation dedicated to supporting young scientists whose ideas were too bold for traditional institutions to accept. James served as the Terran ambassador to the hegemony for 2 decades before retiring from diplomatic service to help Keleth manage the foundation. And together they traveled to dozens of worlds where they planted gardens featuring Earth species, alongside plants from across the galaxy. The sunflower seeds he had given her during their courtship grew into a magnificent display that became one of the most famous attractions in the Volanthi Palace. And every year on the anniversary of their wedding, they would walk among the towering golden flowers and remember the days when their future had seemed impossible. 5 years after the wedding, their first child was born. She was a girl with silver skin and 2 bright brown eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. And they named her Lyra after a constellation visible from Earth that James had always loved. Lyra grew up surrounded by love and encouraged to pursue her own dreams, whatever they might be. And she inherited her mother's brilliance for science and her father's stubborn determination to never give up when Lyra was old enough to understand. Keleth told her the story of how her parents had met, how a princess nobody wanted had been humiliated before the entire galaxy until a human from a distant world had stepped forward and changed everything. Your father taught me something important, Keleth explained as they sat together in the garden, surrounded by sunflowers and cherry blossoms and plants from 100 different worlds. He taught me that the ones who get rejected by fools are usually the ones worth knowing. Lyra looked up at her mother with those strange, beautiful eyes that were neither fully human nor fully Volanthi. What made him different? She asked. Why did he choose you when nobody else did? Keleth smiled and looked across the garden to where James was carefully tending to a new batch of oak saplings he had planted just last season. Because he saw me, she said simply. Not my political value, or my genetic potential, or my strategic importance, but me, who I actually was, and who I wanted to become. She pulled her daughter close and pressed her forehead to Lyra's in the traditional gesture of affection. "That is what humans do," she said. "They look at the universe and see not what is, but what could be. And then they are too stubborn to accept any reason why it cannot happen." James looked up from his work and saw his wife and daughter watching him. And he smiled that same warm smile that had first captured Keleth's hearts all those years ago in the grand selection chamber. He walked over to join them. And for a long moment, the three of them simply stood together in the garden, surrounded by impossible plants and improbable love, and the proof that the universe was far more wonderful than anyone had ever dared to believe somewhere out in the galaxy. The story of the unwanted princess and the human who chose her was still being told, inspiring young beings of every species to believe that they too might find someone who would see their true worth. And in garden after garden across 1,000 worlds, sunflowers turned their faces toward distant suns and bloomed golden and bright, living monuments to the stubborn human faith that anything, absolutely anything, was possible. This was humanity's gift to the stars, not weapons or technology or conquest, but the simple, powerful, revolutionary idea that every being deserved to be seen, that sometimes the ones who seemed least important were the ones who would change everything